Hi, it's Joann. I found this book, Bickie's Thunder Egg, and it's by Bert Rhodes. It was copyrighted in 1960, and he says he's dedicated to my pupils of yesteryear. It contains 13 chapters in this little book, and so I'm going to do an evening read. If there's any pictures, I will show them to you. So here it goes. The March wind howled through the grove of leafless maples back of the little house on an Iowa homestead. It caught at the naked rose vine on the front porch and jerked it back and forth, making the thumping sound against the window. Bickie Ross heard the moaning wind and bumping of the shaken vine. He felt the icy chill of the tiny bedroom, and the thick, choking odor filled his nostrils. He sneezed. Then he pulled a very heavy quilt over his head, and he shut out the cold, rest-disturbing air. It was easier to breathe under the covers. He snuggled up to his younger brother, Tommy, and drifted slowly to sleep. Then the quilts were thrown back. The freezing air struck Bickie through his thin nightshirt. A strange brightness shone in the room, and the crackling and the spitting noise seemed to be marching toward him from some place very near. In the weird dancing light, he made out a blurry figure dressed in a thick overcoat with a full fur collar. It was their neighbor, Red Hog Smith. He shouted at them, "Fire! Fire! The house is afire! Do you hear?" He dragged them from their warm bed towards the window of the little room. With a blow of his mitten, he smashed the inner panes and the outer storm windows. He pushed off the jagged splinters of broken glass around the frame. Bickie heard Mother's voice calling his name, and Tommy's. The voice came from outside, and it was hardly Mother's voice, so wild and so afraid. Red Hog snatched up all the quilts together with the feather bed, and Corn Shuck ticked it under. He shoved all the bedding through the smashed window. Then he grabbed Bickie and dropped him out. Tommy landed on top of Bickie. An instant later, the boys having landed on the pile of feathered pillows, quilts, and they were not hurt, although the drop was 12 feet or more. Mother's arms reached for them. "Oh, Bickie! Oh, Tommy!" she cried, and she pulled them back away from the house. "Pull this stuff away," Red Hog shouted at them. "Get over here with that snowbank away from that wall." Red Hog was flinging things out the window, helter-skelter. He dragged at a pile until it was several yards from the house. Then Mother made the boys stand on the still warm covers, for the snow chilled their bare little feet. "It's all right, don't cry." She held them close. "We are all safe." And Bickie saw Mother hold on her old coat over her nightie. Her feet were bare too. She ran back toward the burning house. Red Hog Smith dropped from the broken window and ran after her. He laid his firm hand on her shoulder. "No, no, Mrs. Ross," he shouted in a great voice. "It's no use. Pity about the house, but it's gone now. No use risking your life. Look, we saved all the bedding and quite a few other things, even that old clock." He pointed to the pile of things in the snow. When everything was pulled back away from the house, Red Hog Smith led Mother back to the quilts where the boys had huddled together under the covers. "You wait here a minute till I look to the granary and the barn. They're far enough away I don't think they'll catch, but I want to be sure." He turned to look at the house again. It was all ablaze. Fire poured from every window. While they looked, the roof fell in with a heavy crash. Although Bickie felt the breath of the hot fire on his face, he was cold, bitterly cold. His feet and his hands were numb. "Wait here," Red Hog told them. I'll just have a look around, and then I'll bring the sled and take you all over to my place. John won't be home till morning." "Will he?" And Bickie remembered that his big brother John was in Marshalltown, 12 miles away. Mother stood there in the light from the burning house, a glint on her long black hair. "No, no, John won't be home. He won't be home. What is today, anyway?" Bickie had never seen his mother so agitated. Red Hog unbuttoned his overcoat, reached into his pocket of his jeans, and drew out a thick silver watch. He looked at it. "Just 12 o'clock midnight." He shook the watch a little bit hard as though he wouldn't believe what it had said. "Seems to me like it ought to be later than that." He put the watch back into his pocket. "If he hadn't seen the fire coming through that roof, you would have all burned up." Mother wrapped the boys in their thick quilts. And here's a picture of what I'm reading. Pretty nice neighbor there, huh? Okay, let's see here. Oh, I guess that's the next page. It is. And then she snuggled them close to her in the feather bed while Red Hog walked back to the barn and the granary. "Is it God's great mercy?" she said. "I was sound asleep. We were all asleep. If Red Hog hadn't been going by and hadn't seen the fire, let us thank God." Bickie could see the dark shape of the sled and the 2 white horses out in the road where Red Hog had left them. Now he saw the big farmer open the gate. He led the horses through into the yard. He brought them right up to the spot where the boys were shivering under the load of quilts. They all got into the sled. Red Hog slipped the lines along the horses' back, and they streaked off over the snow towards the Smith house, 2 miles down the road toward the open country east of State Center, Iowa. "I was just coming home from the school meeting," he said, as his wife hurried about getting warm soapstones and rubbing the boys' cold feet. "It was a lucky thing I saw that fire. I say a lucky thing." Mrs. Smith made a bed for Bickie and Tommy on the floor of the little parlor, and the 2 boys settled themselves under the nice warm covers. But Bickie, he couldn't sleep. He kept remembering how the fire was billowing out of that house, their own house, the only house he had ever lived in. The crash of the roof and into the flaming building it still sounded in his ears. "Are you asleep, Tommy?" he whispered. "Of course not, Tommy." Tommy drew himself up on his elbows. "I don't feel sleepy at all. Do you suppose we'll ever live in Red Hodge's house now?" Bickie thought that for about a minute. "Well, maybe we will build our house again." "Who will?" "Oh, maybe John. And, maybe Red Hog would help, and maybe Mr. Whitney and Nels and Peter's father. I heard Mama say that our house cost $1,500 to build, and I guess none of us has enough money to build it again." Tommy lay down again and shuffled his pillow to make it a little more comfortable. "His father was alive," Bickie began, "but Father is dead. Uncle Dirk is dead." Tommy said, "That means we won't ever come back to help us. Not ever. Not anymore." The boys didn't like to talk anymore because they knew that they might cry if they did, and they were both too big to cry. Bickie was 9 and Tommy was 7. Bickie remembered how many things about the house. Now that it had burned, it seemed more important somehow. Uncle Dirk had built the house when he came back from California 4 years before the war, and he had lived in California for almost 10 years. He went out with the 49ers. Of course, Bickie couldn't remember so far back, but he knew because he had heard Mother tell him about it so many times. Bickie didn't even remember when the house was built, but he had been born in that house, and now it was burned. All burned up. The house was not big, but it was good. Bickie shut his eyes. He could see how nice the house looked with all the yellow rose vines over the front porch and the 2 tiny windows that opened out of the garret over the porch roof. Of course, no one ever went up into the garret. but the little window looked nice from the front. There was a cellar under the house, too. It was walled with red sandstone. All the foundation of the house were red sandstone, and the cellar floors and boards laid on it and made it nice. Then, while Bickie was still small, the war had come. Father and Uncle Dirk both marched away with the Union soldiers. Johnny was hardly old enough to manage a little farm, even with Mother's help. Tommy was just a tiny baby then. And now Bickie ached at the thought. Hank Collins had more to say about the farm than anyone else. Bickie hadn't known exactly why, but Mother said it was because of the mortgage. She explained to them what a mortgage was, and now Bickie understood whatever they harvested, any grain or sold, a hog or a calf, Hank Collins would be right there to take all that money. He knew there was no money left for them to buy food or clothes, or other people had to help them. So Mother went to nurse sick people, and sometimes she took in washing to get food money. Bickie wondered if Hank Collins would say what he would say about this fire. Hank Collins, with his long, sharp nose, his bald head, and his thin mouth that always looked like he had just been sucking on something that was about to begin. Bickie knew from Tommy breathing that he was fast asleep now. But for him, sleep would not come until finally it was morning. Most of the boys' clothing had been saved from the fire. Red Hog had thrown all the clothing and the bedding he could find out the window. Several old trunks of Mother's were stored in the granary, and several extra quilts and blankets were in them. Early the following morning, Red Hog went over and picked up what clothes he could find, and later they all went over to the sled to see the ruins of the house and plan what to do. I know what. Mother looked at herself. For the first time since the fire, we can use the granary for a house. Ooh, that would be cold, said Red Hog. You'll freeze. And it's plenty drafty. John and the boys can clink up the cracks, said Mother. After all, it is the middle of March, and the snow will be gone soon. Next month, spring will begin. Well, just as you say, ma'am. Red Hog pulled at his thick beard. I guess the neighbors will help get some furniture together. You can think the cook stove out there over the wash house. It's big and it's pretty good shape. Has a good oven, too. They were all standing there looking at the granary and planning about it when John drove into the yard. Bickie had never seen his older brother so pale and worried. He came toward them, his lips twitching and his eyes dark and hurt. Mother, he threw his arms around her. Are you all right? However did it happen? Mother explained how Red Hog had passed the fire and had wakened them. I suppose the fire may have started from the chimney. We were keeping up the fire because it was so cold. What are you going to do now? John still kept his arm around his mother. We will fix up the granary and live in that. Don't you think that's a fine idea? Bickie saw John's face brighten. Of course it's a fine idea. We can fix it up. It'll be comfortable. I'll bank on it, and I'll cinch up the walls. Bick and Tom will help. They all looked up to the sound of wheels. A rig was coming down the road and the east at a good fast gallop. One glance, and Bickie knew it was Hank Collins. He went over and stood close to his mother. He saw John's face harden and his heavy jaw set in a determined line. John looked grown up with his face when it got all stiff like that. Although he wasn't any taller than Mother. He was 16, and that is a good age for a boy. Hank tied his horse to the post in the front of the gate and came hurrying towards them. His face twisted into a scowl. Ooh. His close-set eyes studied the ruins of the burned house. His thin mouth quivered with excitement. Mrs. Ross? John, he began. His voice was hard. This cuts down my security to almost nothing. We didn't burn it on purpose. John took one step towards Hank. We need it worse than you do. Don't be sassing me, young'un. Hank's words bubbled and spattered as he spoke them, like they were coming out of a hot kettle. Either you get this house up again as good as it was before, or you get fixed to pay me what you owe. Then Red Hog Smith spoke up. I wouldn't be too hard on Mrs. Ross, he said in his friendly voice. John here is a hard-working feller. He'll pay every cent of that $300, I'm sure, if you give him a little time. This is none of your put in. Hank shook his finger at Red Hog's face, and his finger trembled. Bickie watched it, fascinated. You tend to your business, and I'll tend to mine. Hank reached out to take hold of John's shoulder, but Red Hodge stepped in between them. He towered over Hank. He thrust his big hand over his overcoat pocket and stood glaring down at that smaller man. Go home. Go home, Mr. Collins. If I hear you bothering Mrs. Ross again, I'll break every bone in your body. Before the week was over, the Ross family had moved into the granary. The neighbors were generous with dishes, pots and pans, and a few pieces of furniture, enough to make a comfortable place. There was even a bureau and a wash basin. John began building a lean-to along the back of the side of the granary. It would make an extra bedroom for the boys. He also built a rude partition through the granary, dividing it into a large kitchen and a small front bedroom for his mother. He found some old lumber in the barn, and he built 3 bedsteads. The old Seth Thomas clock, miraculously saved from that fire, hung on the wall over the kitchen table, and it ticked off the hours of that spring and early summer until June came. School was over, and Bickie spent long days playing with Tommy in the maple grove back of the granary. To the side of the little, and a little nearer to the road, the ruin of the burned house stood, black and crumbled, while around it the weeds grew tall and thick. The yellow rose vine in front of the house burned so badly, but now it was sending up a strong new shoot. Mother had scraped the ashes away from it and had tended it so carefully. Who knows, she said to the boys as she drove a strong stake for the new vine to climb. Someday we might build another house right here on this foundation, when the rose vine will be all ready to train over the new porch again. So tomorrow's story is called The Buried Stone. So we'll be on chapter 2 tomorrow. Have a great evening, everyone.